Curious.
Desperate.
Bewildered.
A bit tearful.
Wisdom.
Questioning look.
Angry. Proud.
Desperate.
Troubled.
Curious.
Adventurous.
Explorer.
Colonial master.
Looking really like into the future from the past.
This is someone who seems to be out of her natural environment, and she's on shore.
What's all this for? All this picture taking and gathering of information.
It's like two worlds colliding.
He's an Eze. Can just see the royalty in him.
So he seems to also kind of being in a kind of interrogational space. Like he also is asking a question of the other person.
Something that portrays the beauty of the African personality, a clear representation of its dignity. There's somebody who is very comfortable in who he represents.
Yeah, he's either going through some kind of rites of passage, he looks like he's a young warrior in training, or possibly he's from a royal family of some sorts.
Wow. Even though I see a kind of a smile, I kind of want to cry when I see this photo.
I'm thinking that she looks like, I don't know what a mother looks like, but she looks very motherly. Looks like she's got a lot of responsibilities.
Okay, her face in of itself doesn't look sad, but her eyes look very sad. Not because of what she's doing or where she is, but like something ages ago. Like there's a long, 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 deep sadness.
Even though African people still tried to maintain degrees of their agency, the general framework was one of colonialism. So in that sense, the image could be considered a violent image.
Yes, it conveys the structural violence of colonialism, undoubtedly. And for me, it really, really raises the issues about the actual nature of European colonization of Africa, and the fact that these, what we see as the Maangamizi, the African Holocaust, these images convey, that. And what is actually disturbing is the fact that there has, as far as I know until now, there has not been an attempt to bring these things into the open for a critical look.
So we are getting ready to commence our proceedings today. And as you can see, we have a rather large panel. My name is Esther Stanford Kosei, and I am co-chairing this evening. And my other co-chair is seated to my left, Professor Paul Basu, who is responsible for the film that we've just been watching. And he will explain. You might be thinking, what's this film got to do with tonight? But trust me, there's a connection, and he will explain that in due course. So I'd like to welcome you all to this very, very historic and important event, which is being co-organised by the Extinction Rebellion Internationalist Solidarity Network in the UK, XR-ISN, the Stop the Maangamizi, We Charge Genocide and Ecocide Campaign, in partnership with all of XR, and in particular in partnership with the whole worldwide movements of movements and allied networks. So we have XRAAN in Africa, XRANA in Asia, and XRAAAYS in Abya Yala, or South America. So the theme of tonight's discussion is 4C plus World Ecocide Alarm. Now is the time to seize together for planet repairs. And before we kind of go any further, it's very traditional within the context of when certainly African heritage communities have events of this magnitude and importance, then it's customary that we begin with something that's called libation. So before I kind of go any further, I would like to introduce libation, and then I will say a bit more about the significance of this event. So at this time, I would like to call on Elder Jendai Sowa, who is going to do libation. And after we have done libation, I will do some introductions so that you know who we all are. Okay, thank you.
We pour libation in honor of the creative forces. We pour libation in honor of those who have gone before. So I ask you to stand in honor and to assume a posture of reverence. That universal energy, known through many natures, expressed through many names, represented in all flora and fauna, represented through Father Heaven and Mother Earth. We recognize that divine presence. We recognize that divine power. And we recognize the omnipotence of that universal energy. Some may call God. Some may call Ngai. Some may call Yahweh. Some may call Oludumare. Some may call Allah. Some may call Alat. Some may call Mwari. We honor that divine power, that divine presence. Ashe. We honor those in the ancestral realm, those indomitable ancestors of great sacrifice. Ashe. Great wisdom. Ashe. Great courage, commitment, determination, sacrifice, and scholarship. We honor those ancestors who fought for our liberation. We honor them for their contribution to the path clearing that they have done. Ashe. I invite you to call on them, brothers and sisters. From the ancients of the Nile Valley, Aha, Menes, right through, Ashe, Ashe, right through to those recent ancestors, Nonzamo, Winnie Mandela, Dr. Francis Cresswellson, Ashe, 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 Ashe. We ask those ancestors, their character, their wisdom, their knowledge, their scholarship, their spiritual clarity to enter into our space today, so we may overstand our purpose and build our armor to fight the genocide and ecocide of the original people of humanity. Ashe. We call on those who have sacrificed, those names we don't know, those written out of history. We honor you. And those in our personal lineage. We honor those ancestors, who we look like, whose genes we carry, the DNA, our character, our behavior. We give thanks for those ancestors. I give credit and praise to my grandmothers, Lindia and Daisy Maud. Ashe. Call on them, brothers and sisters. Call on them.
Courtney Stanford.
Ashe. 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 Let them drink. Ashe. Ashe. We ask for their continued guidance and protection. We ask them to vanquish the haters, the spies, the enemies, the agents from within our midst who have come to undermine our efforts for liberation, who have come to undermine our efforts to save humanity. Ashe. Ashe. We ask them to remove those spirits, to remove those energies, to remove the deniers, the Maangamizi criminals from within our midst. Ashe. And with those requests, we give thanks and praise. The ancestors are now with us. They have entered our space. We honor them. Please be seated.
Thank you very much, Elder Sister Jendai, for the libation. This evening is an evening of a difference in the sense of why we've chosen to have this meeting in Brixton, this cross-community, cross-constituency dialogue is very, very important. And what we have here are representatives of African heritage, communities from Abya Yala, people from Asia and other parts of the world, the global south, as us here as diaspora communities, but also working in partnership and alliance with the whole of Extinction Rebellion. And one of the issues that has come up a lot in relation to Extinction Rebellion is a lack of, if you like, community engagement. This is one of the critiques that has constantly been there in relation to how are we engaging, or how do we engage with communities from the global south, especially those diaspora communities who are already here in the UK and maintain those connections back home, wherever home is. And of course, much of the scaremongering that is out there about Extinction Rebellion, and of course it wasn't very helpful in terms of the police declaring Extinction Rebellion as a terrorist group. That has had severe implications for many of our communities who are already over-policed, over-surveilled. And so when we're thinking about how do we create an environment and a space that is safe for us to come together, because we know that as humanity, we are in dire straits. And unless we're able to find that effective way of working together, then we're all going to be in great problems. So tonight is really an ambitious agenda to do that, to do what hasn't been done as effectively and as well up until now. And we've particularly chosen Brixton because Brixton is a site of black community resistance in this country. And we feel it's really important, if we're going to talk about grounding with communities, that we recognize the ongoing resistance of communities who are struggling, who are resisting oppression, and whose efforts are contributing to this world of global justice for all that we in the Stop the Maangamizi campaign refer to as Ubuntu Dunia, which is a future world, okay, that we have hope that we can achieve. But it's only going to be premised on us coming together and recognizing our struggles, which at the moment may seem distinct, but it is about finding that common ground. And so that is really the purpose with which, from a Stop the Maangamizi and the Extinction Rebellion Internationalist Solidarity Network perspective, that we are seeking to do this evening. So I just wanted to let you know about some of the panelists. So on the right to me, we have a section of African heritage community elders. As is common within our African heritage communities, whether we're born directly in Africa, the so-called Caribbean, the so-called Americas or Abya Yala, or even here in Europe or anywhere else in the world, it is customary for us to recognize our elders who are wisdom keepers and who help guide the generations, especially when we are going off track. And so on to the right of me is a selection of esteemed elders in our communities who are recognized for their contribution to our people's liberation struggle. But we're commencing with an opening ceremony and the libation and the contribution from Cecilia Cruz and Chipchaz.
Ay, ¿por qué será que a mi pueblo lo hacen callar? Ay, ¿por qué será que a mi pueblo lo hacen callar? Ay, ¿por qué será que a mi pueblo lo hacen callar? Ay, ¿por qué será que a mi pueblo lo hacen callar? Con este bello pregón quiero contarle, mi amigo, con este bello pregón quiero contarle, mi amiga, los sentires de mi gente los encuentran malheridos, los sentires de mi gente que se encuentran malheridos. ¿Y por qué será que a mi pueblo lo hacen callar? Ay, ¿por qué será que a mi pueblo lo hacen callar? Avalan al dictador, son cosas que a mí me duelen. Avalan al dictador, son cosas que a mí me duelen. Y juegan con el dolor y el recuerdo que ellos tienen. Y juegan con el dolor y el recuerdo que ellos tienen. ¿Y por qué será que a mi pueblo lo hacen callar? Ay, ¿por qué será que a mi pueblo lo hacen callar? Cuando veo represión de los que visten de verde, cuando veo represión de los que visten de verde, si a la calle aquí se sale, es porque el pueblo lo siente. Si a la calle aquí se sale, es porque el pueblo lo siente. Ay, ¿por qué será que a mi pueblo lo hacen callar? Ay, ¿por qué será que a mi pueblo lo hacen callar? A darle duro al tambor, que buen parado mapuches. A darle duro al tambor, de buen parado mapuches. Que cuida a la madre tierra de quien la explota y reduce. Que cuida a la madre tierra de la explota y reduce. Ay, ¿por qué hacen callar, ay, ¿por qué será? Que a mi pueblo lo hacen callar. Y seguiremos luchando, seguimos pues transformando. Y seguiremos luchando, seguiremos transformando. ¿Y por qué será? ¿Por qué será? A mi pueblo lo hacen callar. ¿Y el por qué será? ¿Por qué será? Que a mi pueblo lo hacen callar. Oiga, señor presidente, póngame mucha atención. Oiga, señor presidente, póngame mucha atención. Hoy mi tierra está clamando, escúchela por favor. Hoy mi tierra está clamando, escúchela por favor. Ay, ¿por qué será? ¿Por qué será? Que a mi pueblo lo hacen callar. Ay, ¿por qué será? ¿Por qué será? Que a mi pueblo lo hacen callar. Ay.
Towards the end of the program as well. So as you've seen, we've had 2 contributions and our ancestors are here. They've traveled out of Africa and you can see the connections between us wherever we have settled as humanity. And that's what we really wanted to invoke this evening. Tonight is not just an event. From the perspective of the Extinction Rebellion Internationalist Solidarity Network and the Stop the Maangamizi campaign, as well as the allied networks XRAAN, the XR Affinity All African Network, XRANA, the XR Affinity Network of Asia, and XRISN, the XR Affinity Network of South Abya Yala. For us, this is part of launching what we are calling the 4 Degrees Plus World Ecocide Alarm Program. So this is the beginning of a series of community engagements as part of something that we have developed called the Global Justice Rebellion Roadshow. And this roadshow is necessary because of the reasons I've already said about communities not necessarily joining or aligning or seeing a connection with Extinction Rebellion, that there is a perception that it's just all white people. Okay, so we've recognized that in order to remedy this, we have to go out into communities. We have to find out what the issues and concerns are, what the struggles are, and find ways to connect to the concern around how do we avert climate and ecological crisis? How do we prevent what is predicted to happen if there is not a change in global economic policy, social policy, and environmental policy? So that's really what this is about. It's a campaign and a program, an initiative. So the work continues, and we intend to go on the road. This is being filmed, so we intend to show this film moving forward. I'd now like to call on Professor Paul Basu, who is going to speak into the film that some of us were watching before, which is called Faces. It's an award-winning film that he will explain in terms of the award that it's just won in terms of the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And the film really demonstrates how we can do community engagement with historical communities from the global south who very much live the legacies of their forebears. So I'd now like to hand over to you.
Thank you. Have I got? Yep. Thank you very much. Delighted to be here and very pleased to be on the table. So thank you indeed for inviting me. I'll come back to the film in a moment. I suppose I just wanted to connect up a couple of things as well. Obviously, the kind of primary purpose of the kind of XR reason, but also emblazoned on the wall there, decolonize, and really to recognize that those are in a way part and parcel of the same thing. The kind of whole birth of the notion of decoloniality is largely down academically, at least, to Walter Mignolo. And one of the arguments he makes, of course, is that we can't really separate coloniality from the kind of modernity that we're living in. And part of the crisis we're facing, of course, is precisely because of this particular form of modernity that we're experiencing. So I think I've been invited here really not because I'm the other panelists here, a particular expert on climate crisis and so on, but a lot of my work has to do with trying to work differently, particularly with archives and historical materials in a kind of a decolonial framework. I'm an anthropologist, and anthropology is probably one of those disciplines that's most tainted with its entanglement in a colonial project. One of the advantages, if one can call it that, of that is that we're very conscious of a difficult history. Because the other point, I suppose, is about thinking, back to what Esther was saying about how are we differently entangled in this? And to say that these things, coloniality and so on, this is a shared history, I think is very true. Although, of course, we're in very different positions in relation to that history. But like it or not, we're all enmeshed in that history. And it's our problem collectively to resolve, every community in the world, of course. So I just want to mention a project that relates to the film that was playing before we got started, which is called Re-Entanglements, which is about this idea of how we're differently entangled in this difficult history, this history of colonialism and its legacies today, which, as I say, I include very much the environmental crisis. So, as an anthropologist, I'm interested in confronting that difficult history of our discipline. Anthropology is partly responsible, of course, for many of these misrepresentations that are still forces for negativity in the world. Many of the stereotypical images and associations of backwardness, of primitiveness, of lack of development, and so on, that we're still kind of confronting. So what happens if we look at the legacy of that in a different kind of a way? And this is the project we're trying to pursue really here. To how can we use, as it were, the legacies of those colonial anthropological projects, as it were, how can we repurpose them so that we actually think differently about these ideas of modernity and development and the inevitability of a certain dominant idea of what progress means, because we're all gathered here today because we recognise the limitations of that idea. So in a small way, what we've been doing is experimenting with a particular anthropological archive that collected by a colonial anthropologist, a government anthropologist in Nigeria and Sierra Leone in the early 20th century, which has left a legacy, a material legacy of photographs and sound recordings, of artifact collections, of copious amounts of publications and archives of one kind or another, including botanical specimens. And the question we've been thinking about is, well, what do these afford? What do they make possible in the present? Recognizing that they were collected, they were assembled for a particular purpose, which was to support specifically a colonial project. How can we repurpose colonial collections and archives, knowledges in a decolonial time? And what lessons do they have for us? And one of the points is that many of these collections, many of these resources document a world very different to the one today. Indeed, a world that in many respects was on the cusp of extinction and in many respects is extinct now. That was a world without plastics and without pesticides. And in many of those places, we've actually been going back to the places where over 6 years this colonial anthropologist was touring around in West Africa, taking these materials back to communities and really asking them, well, what do these mean for you, to look back at these times? And it's very striking, of course, the contrast between the world that we see today, largely urbanized, environmentally depleted, plenty of plastic waste and so on everywhere, and these other worlds. And it's very easy to be romantic about those pasts. I'm sure they were also very difficult times for other reasons. But nevertheless, the question is what's gained and what's lost in that intervening 100 years since these things have happened? And as the film was another attempt, I mean, because we need to recognize that there are multiple publics, multiple communities, and each perceives something different in these materials. And then the question really becomes, well, who has access to them? Who has control over them? And the project becomes one of liberating these materials. So what I suppose I'm getting at is the fact that over the course of our colonial history, which we are differently entangled with, there's actually a reservoir of knowledge, and that it's the epistemological control of that, deciding what it means, as it were, is in the hands of a very small group of people and institutions in particular, institutions that seem to think. So the project's very much about trying to liberate these things from their sequestered state and actually do something very simple, and that's actually ask differently positioned communities, differently positioned individuals, what they do for them, what's possible in them. And as I say, really thinking back into the main kind of thrust, the XR kind of agenda, you know, what particularly do they teach us? What do they show that we have to unlearn, as it were, to think differently about what futures they make inevitable, as it were? Are there ways, are there lessons that we can learn by going back to these archives, these sequestered knowledges, these indigenous knowledges that unfortunately are often extinct in the places in which they came, but ironically are now actually sequestered in institutions, often colonial institutions, where actually there's a reservoir of knowledge there that we can indeed access, and that it's our right to appropriate it in a way. And surprisingly, many institutions actually welcoming that appropriation, I've discovered. So I think it is a question of learning and unlearning, learning how to access these materials to contribute to our bigger debates, and thinking about how we can utilize that reservoir of past knowledge that's actually on our doorstep.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Paul Basu, for that intervention on the importance of recognizing indigenous knowledges and how we must, and what I take from what you said is how do we utilize that knowledge in finding the solutions that we're here to talk about this evening. But without further ado, I'd like to now pass over to Tim, who is going to introduce some of the questions that are framing our discussion this evening. Oh, you've got a mic. Okay.
My name is Tim Crosland, and it's so good to be here. I'm a lawyer with the climate litigation charity Plan B. My main job is to sue the government for its criminal and genocidal inaction on the climate crisis. And what that really means is presenting the science to the court and asking the question, well, since the government knows that this is the situation, since it knows that we're heading towards disaster, why does it keep driving in the same direction and calling that progress? The questions we're going to be confronting today as a panel, first of all, what is the risk that the world crosses a 4 degrees Celsius threshold? And second, what are the implications of that? What does that really mean? And you might wonder, well, why are we dealing with something so abstract? Why are we talking about degrees Celsius when all around us there are people dying at scale, there are people being displaced in vast numbers? We're seeing the devastation of our brutal economic system all over the world. Why are we talking about degrees Celsius? Well, there's a reason that we're bringing this to you tonight, and that's this feeling that there is information that people have that is known, that is vital to all of us, that is not being properly communicated. And I'll just give you one example of why we feel that is the case. I spoke to Sir David King in 2016. He was the government's former chief scientist. He led the UK delegation to Paris, produced the Paris Agreement. He told me he'd wanted to connect with the public before Paris, to land with the public, the true gravity of the situation we all find ourselves in together. And then he was stopped from doing that by 10 Downing Street, by the special advisors in 10 Downing Street, who said, we don't want to do that because that's going to upset the Murdoch press. And that's not the right move for us right now. So that's one example of why we feel the right information isn't getting through, and vested interests are actively promoting misinformation. The main purpose of tonight is to face up to the truth of the situation. In the words of James Baldwin, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. We shouldn't be asking a question about 4 degrees because 4 degrees is mad. We shouldn't be anywhere near it. What was said by the Committee on Climate Change in 2008 is 4 degrees is extreme danger. In any sane world, we keep the probability of that to exceptionally low level, less than 1%. Well, let me just read out to you a small bit. I need to end soon. I've had my sign from the ping pong bat. This is a signed statement from Sir David King from 3 days ago. A temperature rise of 4 degrees Celsius would give rise to unmanageable risks, and yet this is the most likely outcome by 2100 unless appropriate global action is taken. There are other people who think it is less than that. 3 degrees, that is still an utterly disastrous outcome. So that is the conversation we're going to be having tonight, and I'll pass on now to Emily.
Do you need me to stand? Hi everyone. Thanks for inviting me. It's really great to be here. I'm Dr. Emily Grossman. I've got a PhD in biology, and I am a science author, science broadcaster, and educator. And I'm also one of the co-founders of Scientists for Extinction Rebellion. And we represent a community of scientists, now 1,600 strong across the globe, who've signed a declaration to say that we now have to take radical action due to government inaction to fight, to combat the climate and ecological emergency. That it's clear and unequivocal that this crisis is happening. And if we don't act and act radically and act now, it will lead to incalculable suffering and loss of life. And scientists are now stepping forward. They're stepping out of their laboratories, of their offices, of the traditional places where scientists have been promised that if we stay behind our desks, behind our microscopes and our data capture, and we report impartially and quietly on the truth, that governments will listen and that they will take action appropriate to that truth, and that it will be reported on by the media. But that has not happened. Scientists have been warning for 40 years now, and that has not happened. It has not been reported on to the extent and the scale of the crisis that we are now in, and governments have not acted anywhere close in line with the warnings that scientists have made. So scientists are now coming out and taking action and saying we need to shout louder, we need to go against what we've been promised as scientists is our role as a scientist, which is not to bring our feelings into it, not to act as humans, but to act as scientists and to be trusted by the government. But no, because the government have let us down. We cannot anymore trust that it's okay to simply report on the facts. So the question that we're addressing in this first point is the 4-degree world. Now, as you've heard, there are top scientists who say that by the end of the century, it's possible or likely that we could cross 4 degrees. That is inconceivable, the world that would be if we crossed to 4 degrees. The projections on our current pathways say that on average we're likely, more than likely, very well, we're heading for 3 degrees, and that there is a good chance that we could cross over into 4 degrees. Now, 3 degrees itself is where we're heading on current policies, even if the government carries on with the policies they've committed to, even if they carry on with the policies that they've promised to, and even if they honour the pledges and the targets that they say they hope to make. Even if they carry on along all those pathways, there is still the most likely chance that we will head towards 2.5 to 3 degrees, and a good chance of going over 4. Now, over 2 degrees is impossible to imagine that we could be heading towards that on this planet, and we're going to talk in a moment about what that would actually look like. But I also want to address the fact that there's a sort of feeling in this country, at least by the government, that often comes up, which is like, well, we're not the biggest polluters, we're not the biggest problems. You know, go ask China, go ask America, you know, it's not our problem. We only emit 1.5% of carbon emissions in this country. Well, that is true. However, 1.5% of carbon emissions is still twice as much as we should be emitting per head. Secondly, 1.5% does not take into account aviation, that's flights. It doesn't take into account shipping, that's boats. That's a huge amount of fossil fuel emissions. And more importantly, is that does not take into account the fossil fuel emissions that are embedded in what we consume, in what we eat, in what we buy, in what we use in this country. It's being reported by that we actually are consuming more embedded emissions than either the US or Japan. Plus, we are investing 15% of carbon emissions come from investments from the City of London. We are spending taxpayers' money, pensions, university funds, investing in fossil fuels overseas. And we also have one of the biggest subsidies for fossil fuel industries. So the EU, it was been reported that in the last 5 years, out of all EU countries, the UK actually invests the most in fossil fuel subsidies. That's £2.5 billion in the last 5 years. So anybody that says, oh, we're doing enough, it is not true. Anyone that says, forget it, it's not going to make any difference, you've got to talk to China, got to talk to America, that's not true. And anyway, anyone says that who says that our fossil fuel emissions are dropping, our carbon emissions are dropping, it is slightly true in this country if you ignore everything I've just said and look at just our terrestrial emissions, but that's only because we've switched recently from burning coal to burning oil and burning natural gas. As soon as that sort of evens out, they will start to go up again. And if there's any chance of staying beneath the catastrophic warming of 2 degrees, we have to peak our global emissions this year in 2020, and we have to start coming down. And in order for global justice, in order for climate justice, in order to take into account the fact that we are a more developed country than a lot of the world, and we have a responsibility for historical emissions, we need to bring our carbon emissions down immediately, and we need to get to net zero by 2025.
Is it okay if I kneel on this chair instead? Hi all, my name's Matthew Shribman. I studied chemistry and biophysics at the University of Oxford, and I do science communication. I wanted to talk to you about the global system and how it's driving us in completely the wrong direction. We live in a system that is completely dependent on endless growth and ever accelerating consumption. If you're running a shoe company and you want to sell shoes, then there's not really much incentive to make high quality shoes. You want to make low quality shoes so that they're destroyed quickly and people need to buy more of them. And this is completely insane in a world where we understand that we need to be using our resources slower. And yet that's the setup of so many of our systems. We live in a world where in many countries it's a legal requirement for companies, which are the dominant forces in these countries, to make decisions that deliver profits rather than favoring human needs. Human needs are complex. We need a lot of different things, but companies are only driving for profit. And it's the perfect cover, because if it's legal to destroy a coral reef and it will be profitable for your company, then it's almost as if you have to do it, because that's what the system is that we exist within. If you look at the Adani mine that's opening in Australia, some calculations show that the burning of the contents of that mine, the coal that could be removed from that mine, could be enough alone to take us over 2 degrees C. It's completely insane that this mine is opening at all. And meanwhile, you have companies like Coca-Cola who just announced at Davos that they can't possibly reduce plastic bottles because that's what consumers want. And how could they stop selling plastic bottles when it's profitable for them? And misunderstandings are being exploited. They're saying things like, oh, well, glass and aluminium are going to release more carbon, and so we have to avoid those and we have to stick with plastic. And this is totally insane, because obviously plastic pollution is destroying much of the ocean ecosystem. We live in a global system as well, where even it's not just the companies, the entire financial system is designed to draw money and wealth towards certain countries. And this favors greater accelerating extraction still. Countries that have greater debt loads are forced to extract more of their natural resources in order to keep up with those debts. And so the world is being completely ravaged by the system that we live within. We live in a bizarre situation where a tree has no price until it's a pile of paper bills. A river has no price until it's blocked by a wall and turning turbines. And a mountain has no price until it's crushed into minerals. And all of this ongoing extraction is also driving further inequality, which is making things even worse. We know that the impacts of climate change and ecological collapse are going to disproportionately hit disadvantaged populations. It was recently shown that the top 22, men in the United States of America have more wealth than all of the women in Africa combined. We know that the changes on the planet are going to disproportionately affect drylands and islands as well as the world heats up and sea levels rise. And we know that diseases like malaria and dengue fever as well are going to massively accelerate. And all of this is going to disproportionately affect parts of the world that we desperately need to protect. Thanks.
Thank you, Tim, Emily, and Matthew, for your contributions. And I just wanted to say a few contributions as well by way of closure of this section. For me, and as a representative of the Stop the Maangamizi campaign and Extinction Rebellion Internationalist Solidarity Network, one of the aspects that we and our communities, communities who are diaspora communities but originally emanate from continents and countries in the global south, unless, there clearly needs to be a paradigm shift and a paradigm change. And so that's why, the second part of the theme for tonight is about now is the time to seize together for planet repairs. And what we are seeking to do and how we've come to find some common ground with Extinction Rebellion is because some of us were on the trajectory of a struggle that is known as a struggle for reparatory justice. And many people often assume that when we say the term reparations, that we are just talking about financial compensation. So of course, compensation for, in terms of climate mitigation and paying, this principle of polluter pays is essential. It is essential. But it is not the only aspect of reparatory justice, because even if we do that and we continue, and the we is the we of the elites who are not listening and who keep burning fossil fuels and who keep extracting from Mother Earth. But if we allow that to happen as members of the human family, then we are going to also be complicit in multiple genocides, which we refer to as omnicide, and of course the ecocide. And inherent within that ecocide is genocide. So from our perspective, we have to recognize that not only do we have to ensure that the resources are released, in terms of the unfair international economic system, not only that they are released, but there is a transformation of that system. And in fact, that kind of thinking was also echoed by Prince Charles at Davos, who spoke about the need for a new economic system. If not, the planet will burn. And that's not just about the planet, we know it's about people and planet. And to us, yes, and for us, that is what we refer to as reparatory justice. And reparatory justice begins with stopping the harms of today, because we cannot necessarily change the past in terms of what has contributed to this situation. And of course, we have to talk about colonization. We have to talk about enslavement. We have to talk about the genocides of many of the world's first peoples, indigenous peoples. And many of us are just here. Yeah, we were never meant to survive, but we did. Because we are the root. We are the mothers and fathers of humanity. But not only do we have to stop the harm, then we have to look at what is this new system? What is this new economy? What is this new political system? And that's where many of you come in. Because we believe that many of you, in terms of your heart and your conscience, and what it is that you're seeking to do is to be part of the change and to be on the right side of history. And for us, that cannot happen without a paradigm of reparatory justice. But not just looking at the damage that's been done to people, but now looking at the damage that has been done to our earthly home, our mother. Okay? And that is why, for us, we're fashioning it within the notion of planet repairs or planet reparations. I'd like to now come back to Tim, who will introduce the second question.
So the second question now is to talk about the implications of a 4-degree world, what that's going to mean for people. And we start with Esther, who's going to tell us a little bit about what's happening now, what's happening already.
Okay. So I'm a bit lost for words, because when we began today, and for us as people of African heritage, and our lineages who have travelled throughout the globe and who have formed civilization and culture outside of Africa, when we call our ancestors in terms of libation, it means they're here with us. They're here with us. So people like myself, people like many of our elders, many of those who are in this audience of African heritage, we were never meant to survive. We were never meant to survive. And as has been said, I was born here, but my father was born in Barbados. And in the so-called Caribbean, where that plantocracy existed, people didn't last longer. They didn't live longer than 7 years. And so the fact that I'm even here to speak about this history and to speak about this history of resistance and to talk about how this began, and how, if we're going to look at how we find solutions, we have to recognize coloniality, as Professor Paul Basu has also mentioned. We have to also decolonize. We have to decolonize our movements. We have to decolonize our thinking. We have to decolonize even our knowledges, because what knowledges are we going to use to fashion this way forward? And we must recognize those that exist within our midst. So when I think about what's happening now, and especially coming out of a Caribbean experience, obviously originally from Africa, but my people were taken to the Caribbean and South Abya Yala, in particular Guyana. And in the Caribbean, there's been a campaign around for about 6 years. And it's a slogan, 1.5 degrees to stay alive. Yeah, 1.5. But we're talking about the possibility of 3, even 4. So in terms of what's happening already, we're literally talking about the fact that many of us were trafficked outside of our homeland and made to settle in the so-called Americas, Abya Yala. But now even those places that we made homes away from homes, we're in danger of losing. So we've seen extreme weathers, we've seen hurricanes, we've seen cyclones, not only in the Caribbean, but also Africa. And our people in the Caribbean are now becoming climate refugees. And when the latest hurricane happened in the Bahamas, and there was an attempt for some of our people to get refuge in terms of going to North America, so-called, then many of them were denied entry. This is what is happening now. Not to mention what is happening to the indigenous peoples of Abya Yala, Australasia, Oceania, the Pacific. All of us, what do we have in common? This history of colonization, this history of enslavement. So when I think about the possibilities of what will happen, it is really unthinkable. It is unthinkable. And so it's a very serious matter, because many of us, we're not just here. We are connected to those homelands. And many of us are here because colonizers went there. And since that time, we have been denied our right to belong, our right to actually inherit, our right to have a say about how the resources of those parts of the world where we emanate from that are there for the use of humanity, but through colonization and continued coloniality, we have this situation where you have a few seeking to rule the many and actually appropriate the resources for all humanity. So that's where we're at today. And for us, it is about genocide and ecocide, and the two go together. And we are survivors of genocide, because genocide, as we know, is not literally exterminating a whole people so they no longer exist. But if you remove from people their essential foundations of life through which they can survive, their culture, their institutions, their knowledge bases, then you are perpetrating genocide. And Raphael Lemkin, Dr. Raphael Lemkin, who fashioned the notion of genocide. He was very concerned with the destruction of a people through the destruction of their cultures. And one of the things that he said is that there are two phases to genocide. One is you destroy the essential foundations of life of a particular group that makes them kind of have sense and have a sense of the purpose and belonging. And the second is that you impose on that subjugated group a way of life of a more dominant group who have subjugated them, oppressed them, terrorized them, enslaved them. So that is the genocide that we're talking about. And that is why we say and we organize with intent to stop the Maangamizi. I'm now going to pass on. Okay. I've been told, thank you for the reminder, Elder Brother Leo, Maangamizi is a key Swahili term that means African Holocaust. Some people would say African Holocaust, but we are, as African people, we seize back the power to define language and our concepts and our realities in terms of cognitive justice. So we talk about a Holocaust, and it is a continuum of chattel enslavement, colonization, and the modern day system of neo-colonialism. Some people would say neoliberal globalization, but it is with an intention to destroy a people. So I'd now like to pass to Emily, who is going to continue. Okay.
Thank you. So I'd just like to talk a little about what's actually going on our planet right now. So we are currently at 1.1 degrees warming above the pre-industrial temperatures. Now that may not sound much, but remember 1 degree or even a fraction of a degree is the difference between water and ice. 1 degree warming also has catastrophic impacts on our atmosphere and on our waters. It may not sound much, but if the air and the atmosphere warms just a little bit, we get far more likely to have extreme weather. That's because it interferes with what's called the jet stream, which is what controls our weather systems and our climate. Sorry, our weather systems controlled by our climate. The jet stream relies on the difference in temperature between the equators and the poles. The thing is, with this 1 degree warming, that's a global average, but the poles are getting much warmer than the equator, which means, they're warming at a higher rate than the equator, which means that the temperature difference now goes down and the jet stream no longer flows like it's supposed to. This causes changes to our weather systems and more likely extreme weather. It also causes, because of the higher temperatures above the oceans, even 1 degree causes an awful lot more water to evaporate from the oceans. The water in the air can also stay in the air to greater concentrations. Warm air can hold more water vapor than normal air. A result of this is that we get not just higher temperatures and heat waves, but we also get stronger and more frequent rainfall. We also get storms where that rainfall suddenly dumps all in one go. We get cyclones, we get droughts where we get the heat causing lack of rainfall. I just want to give you some examples of where we are right now. So in 2019, I'm sure you're aware, we saw record-breaking temperatures. We had 400 temperature records were broken across the globe. It was the warmest October on record, the joint warmest September on record. 19 of the hottest 20 years have been in the last 20 years. In July, we got the hottest ever day in the UK, and globally, July was the hottest day ever recorded across the planet. In France and the Netherlands, the record-breaking temperatures were estimated to have been made 100 times more likely because of climate change. In the UK, 20 times more likely. Now, this will just get worse. And as temperatures rise, remember, we heard that we're heading towards 1.5 degrees. The estimates now is that we're going to head to 1.5 degrees by 2040, and actually some experts have said we're going to get there by 2030. This is not acceptable. We've been told we committed to the Paris Agreement to say that we have to stay below 2 degrees and absolutely have to try our best to stay below 1.5. At current projections, we're heading to 2 degrees, certainly by kind of 2060, 2070, but a lot of experts suggest we're actually heading to 2 degrees by 2045. So in terms of the heat wave, extreme heat waves are going to become an average European summer by 2040. And of course, that's much worse in countries such as the global south across the globe. We will get 350 million more people will be at risk of heat stress by 2050. We'll see a trebling of heat stress here in the UK, people dying from heat-related issues. As we move towards 2 degrees, there's going to be 37% more of the population who are exposed to severe heat waves. That's 420 million people being exposed to extreme heat waves across the globe, and 65 million more people than if we got to 1.5 degrees. If we get to 2 degrees, that's 65 million more people being exposed to exceptional heat. I just want to talk for a moment. I know I've got to hurry up. I've got to talk to a moment about storms. We all know India had the heaviest monsoon in 25 years last year, 1,600 dead. In Paraguay and Bolivia, 100,000 people left displaced from their homes because of flooding. In East Africa, there was the strongest dipole on record, which led to flooding that displaced hundreds of thousands of people in Somalia and southern Sudan, killing hundreds in Kenya, Ethiopia, and Tanzania. Venice was hit by a storm that was the worst floods in 50 years, also because of rising sea levels. And here in Yorkshire, we had 1,000 properties evacuated, 500 homes flooded because of floods here in the UK. The estimates is that as global temperatures rise even to 1.5 or 2 degrees by 2050, floods that happened once every 100 years will now be happening once every other year. You heard about hurricanes in the Bahamas. A Category 5 hurricane was the most intense on record in 2019, leaving 70,000 homeless. Typhoon Haggis in Japan was the strongest in 6 decades. In Mozambique, Cyclone Idai was deemed one of the worst weather-related disasters to hit the southern hemisphere, resulting in 1,300 deaths. Hundreds of thousands of people were displaced. These are record-breaking extreme weather events. They would not be happening at nearly this much frequency or regularity if it wasn't for climate change, and the temperatures are going up. We're heading up towards 1.5, over 2 by 2050. If we look at droughts, I know I've got to stop and say a couple more things. If we look at droughts, this is really important. In Cape Town in 2018, there was a drought that led to the city becoming within days of having to turn off its water supply. These types of droughts are going to be happening at least 3 times more likely, or up to 9 times more likely if we hit just 2 degrees. In Zimbabwe in 2019, they had the lowest rainfall in the last 30 years, causing severe droughts, pushing 5.5 million people into extreme water scarcity and food insecurity. If we get to 2 degrees, 50% more people, because of climate change, will be suffering from water stress. Up to 200 million people will be suffering from increased water scarcity just by going from here to 2 degrees. And then we also have to look at the economy. We have to look at poverty. If we get to 2 degrees, several hundred million more people around the world will be exposed to climate-related poverty. There'll be more incidences of malaria and dengue fever because of increasing temperatures, making them more likely to be transmitted. The coral reefs are going to be pretty much gone if we get to 2 degrees, 70 to 80% gone even if we get to 1.5 degrees. Sea level rise, huge issue, particularly for countries in parts of Asia and in parts of northern Africa. If we even just get to 2 degrees temperature rise, we're looking at a 10 centimetre increase in sea level, maybe 20 centimetres in some parts of the world. That's going to we're looking at 10.4 million more people exposed to flooding risks. By 2050, there will be 300 million people in parts of the world that are going to be flooded at least once a year. That is 300 million people who are going to have to move to be displaced because of flooding risks. So we're also looking at huge impacts on our economy, but who cares? There's far more important issues at stake here.
Thank you.
I just want to start with the words of Professor Jonas Rockström, who says that the consequences of a 4 degrees C warmer world are so terrifying that most scientists would rather not contemplate them, let alone work out a survival strategy. Worse still is that within the projections that we have, again, a quote from Rockström, we have likely severely underestimated the implication of tipping points. And that's what I'm going to talk about now. You'll have seen Greta in her speeches talking about the fact that we have 8 years remaining of carbon budget if we're to have a reasonable chance of staying below 1.5 degrees. That projection also does not really include tipping points. At the moment, you have to imagine that we're on a boat and we are heading towards a waterfall and we are speeding towards it as fast as we possibly can. And we could turn around, but we're not. We're continuing to head in that direction. And as we do so, we're seeing increasing amounts of collapse, ecological collapse, 1 million species on the brink of extinction, which is affecting even small things. Think about the chocolate midge is on the brink of extinction, and so we're probably going to lose our ability to produce even chocolate. We can feel the weather changing. And actually, for me, I feel strangely optimistic about this, even though I find it absolutely terrifying, because I find the fact that we can feel that the weather is changing to be something that people can really connect with, and it suddenly becomes really impossible to deny that this is happening. With reference to the global south, this is occurring even more extremely. For example, a 3 degrees C global temperature rise equates to an approximately 6 degrees C temperature rise for southern Africa and the Sahara region. So what are these tipping points that we're talking about? So there are some that you may be more familiar with, and maybe you're familiar with all of them. For example, the melting of ice. The ice caps sit at the top and the bottom of the Earth, and they're very white. And because they're white, they reflect the heat of the sun. And as they melt away, the dark ocean that's exposed underneath absorbs the heat of the sun instead. And so, as a consequence, the heat that melts the ice then accelerates the absorption of even more heat. As this happens, a lot of the ice that's melting is methane clathrates, which is ice that contains large amounts of methane, which is one of the most potent greenhouse gases that we know of. And so as that ice melts, it accelerates the global heating effect even more. Forests, you see what's happening in Australia. These forest fires are getting more intense because the world is becoming hotter and drier. And these trees are all adapted for the region that they survive within. They're not adapted to face the incredibly rapid change that's occurring. And that's why you have the en masse dying of the baobab trees, the beautiful baobab. I really love baobab trees. And I literally heard today that the giant sequoias as well in the Americas are also succumbing to bark beetles that they used to be completely resistant to, and because of the severe droughts, they're losing their ability to resist that. And so those trees will begin to die off as well. And this is, again, a tipping point, because the trees are one of our best means to lock up carbon. And so as they disappear, not only are we not locking up carbon... Oh, I'm running out of time. Okay. I probably will just stop there, otherwise I'm going to ramble on to more things. I'll stop there. I'll just conclude by saying the problem with these tipping points is that they're leading us further and further into a scenario that we call hothouse Earth. So this was the reference that I was making to the waterfall. The problem is that we're very fast approaching a point that we believe, once we pass it, these tipping points will create these feedback mechanisms where even if we try to stop burning fossil fuels, even if we try to stop pumping extra carbon into the atmosphere, it might be too late. And it will certainly continue to be too late if we continue on this path. Because the world will keep getting hotter and hotter, and all of these loops will continue to accelerate that. And that's what we desperately need to avoid. Thank you.
And just to take up from Matthew there on tipping points, as we find ourselves surrounded in the news by the wildfires, the devastating wildfires in Australia that have been displacing people, that have burnt a billion animals to death. There's one other example, the Amazon rainforest, devastating fires there this year. But there's modelling from the UK Met Office that says because the Amazon rainforest has evolved in conditions of constant humidity, it has little or no resistance to fire. And so you get to 2 to 3 degrees warming, the whole Amazon dries out to the point that you get these sorts of fires and the whole of it goes down. Our largest land-based carbon sink that is absorbing carbon releases all of that carbon-based life into the atmosphere, compounding the situation that we're in. Just 2 bits of information about a 4-degree world. I don't think we really need that much. I think our imaginations tell us what this means. A comment from Professor Kevin Anderson, who's an advisor to the government. Whatever he knows, the government knows. There's a widespread view that 4 degrees is incompatible with an organized global community. It is beyond adaptation. It is devastating to ecosystems. It is highly unlikely to be stable, and consequently 4 degrees Celsius should be avoided at all costs. And then, to continue the quote from Professor Johan Rogström, who's one of the world's leading scientists, very mainstream scientist, advisor to governments. This was in The Guardian in May. It was quite a way down the article, on page 16. Rogström doesn't like our chances. It's difficult to see how we could accommodate 8 billion people, or even half that, he says. There will be a rich minority of people who survive with modern lifestyles, no doubt, but it will be a turbulent, conflict-ridden world. And there's something so surreal about reading on page 16 at the bottom of an article, and it's not even the headline, something that says we're heading to a situation in which billions of people are going to die, that I wrote to him and said, can I just check you weren't misquoted? And I'm just going to read the email that he sent back to me. It says, what I was referring to is that a 4C world will not, as far as we know today, be able to accommodate an 8 billion world, i.e. our current population of 7.7 rounded to 8. Or maybe not even half of that, in my judgment. This is, in my assessment, a reasonable but still disastrous and dramatic outcome, that we're moving towards a climate state that could not accommodate today's population, much less a 10 billion population, and which may cut population down dramatically from current totals. So I think we need to ask why that isn't headline news, why we're not talking about it every day. What would it be like if we read on page 16, there's a 50% chance an asteroid is heading for the Earth? Well, we are that asteroid. And the reason it's on page 16 is because this information, the truth of what the scientific community knows, what it's telling us is that the Titanic of the neo-colonial order is sinking. It's the proof that this disastrous system isn't working, and people don't want us to know that just yet. And we've got to come together around that now. And that's the second part of the evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim. Before we are going to give you an opportunity to make some responses from the floor, but before we do that, I would just like to go to Elder Nana Koju Bonsu to give a response from our elders here to what you have just heard, and then we will hear from some of you.
Okay, my name is Kojo Asara Bonsu, and based on the information that we have received, it indicates that my ancestors were very much on par with seeing the need for the preservation, the protection, and the promotion of Mother Earth and the universe. With the introduction of European Christianity and the missionaries, they were deemed to be pagans, heathens, animists, and even fetish. But as we head towards a direction that in their wisdom they had foreseen, one of the ancestors by the name of Claude McKay, he penned a poem which was made known to Europe and European people by the then Prime Minister during the Second European Tribal War years, Winston Churchill. And the title of the poem is If We Must Die. If we must die, if we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot. While round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our accursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us, though dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave, and for their 1,000 blows deal one death blow. What, though before us lies the open grave? Like men, we'll face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back. Words of ancestor Claude McKay, who in his time between 1889 and 1948 wrote about social and political concerns from his perspective as an African man in the US, and therefore continuing the legacy and the tradition of resisting to maintain a balance, the order, and the balance, order, and rhythm of nature in all its aspect, even to us as humanity. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I'd now like to just open for a couple of questions. We only have about 5 minutes, I'm sorry, to hear any questions that people in the audience may wish to ask at this time. So can I ask, whoever would like to ask a question, perhaps if you could come to the front so that we can hear you loudly and clear. Okay. Anyone for a question or a comment? Okay, yes, please make your way to the front. Anyone else? It's okay if you don't want to, we can move on. We've got lots to talk about and we want to come to the place where you're much more engaged in the discourse. Yes. If you could introduce yourself. And thank you.
I first want to say, Aiko, thank you, everybody, for what you're doing. My name's Michael. I've been involved with Extinction Rebellion with a really good group of people, Extinction Rebellion Jews. My family are from Ghana, we're Jews from Ghana. It's so refreshing to see all these different people together and working together. And my question that I want to ask the elders and people in the audience and the scientists here, thank you so much for everything you've explained to us. I've got shivers talking about 4 degrees. It's going to be horrific. It just doesn't bear thinking about. So my question is, in my group, in Extinction Rebellion Jews, there's Jews from all around the world, from places in the Caribbean, from other places in Africa, as well as West Africa, and Europe as well. And we work in solidarity. I think one of the big things we need to think about in the future is how we all work together, all the different communities. Because if, God forbid, society does start to struggle and break down in some way, the thing we need to think about is how we work together with each other and how we carry on. So if any of the elders or any of the scientists want to say anything about that, I'd be really grateful to hear. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I ask if there's anyone else who would like to ask a question, if you can make your way to the front now, and then we will have the responses. Anyone else? Okay, thank you. Yeah, you could. Has someone got the mic? Okay. If you can come and introduce yourself and ask your question. Thank you.
Hello. My name's Casper. I work with the Media Tell the Truth group and other groups within XR. And I just want to pick up on a point that Tim Crossland made earlier on about the media, who I think it's really dawning on us how effective the media are at shaping opinion, certainly in the English-speaking world and probably throughout the rest of the countries in the world. And as Tim touched upon, this media, especially the corporate media, is owned by a handful of outrageously rich billionaires. And I'd just like to hear how you think we can influence these billionaire media owners to join our battle to try and retain as much of a habitable environment on our planet for the future generations as we possibly can.
Thank you. And we're going to hear the last question from yourself, and then we have to move on. Thank you.
Thanks. Mothia with guardianship and XR Muslims. And I guess it's linked to both those questions around who, because we talked about solidarity and working together, and then also talking about who owns the platforms by which power and influence happens. And so, how do we... With all this messaging around this, I mean, for example, there's a new website which I've seen, Population Matters, which is David Attenborough. I'm not saying that this is, but these messages could be used in a particular way. So he's quoted as saying, all our environmental problems become easier to solve with fewer people and harder and ultimately impossible to solve with ever more people. So when you have quotes like that and you have people who are influencing and have power over particular platforms, how can we actually, how can we come together and not have the issues determined in a way that we don't want it to happen?
Okay. Thank you. I'd like to have responses now from our panel.
So I think all such excellent questions, but with this common theme around solidarity and division, and it comes back a little bit to a point that Matthew made earlier on about inequality, and another figure, the 26 wealthiest people on the planet own more than 3.8 billion. And that's such a crazy situation when many of us live in democracies. How is that even possible? It's possible by distracting us and by dividing us from each other. That's the only thing that makes it possible to convince people with a lie that it's, other groups that are the problem, that it's immigration that is the problem. This is the false narrative that is put out for the express purpose of dividing us from each other, so we don't see what's really happening. And so this is the fundamental point, and this is what tonight is all about. It's refusing to be divided and distracted. It's uniting together and building together and co-creating together. And if we do that, that's when we've got hope together.
I don't know how qualified I am to reply to a lot of these extremely difficult questions, but I will say one thing about media. A lot of the world's media is now extremely centrally controlled, and as a consequence, it often puts out extremely distorted messages. But there are people in the world who are very good at staying true to themselves and true to the reality, and are trying to get really good messages out there. And it helps a lot to be really to find these people and build around them and help to support them. There are amazing people who are writing on climate. For example, George Monbiot is absolutely excellent, and I'm sure you all know who he is, and if you don't, he's an amazing writer at The Guardian who's at the top of his game. But still, loads of people I have met over the last year just don't even know who he is. We're becoming more and more divided by this internet system as well that puts us in echo chambers, and we really need to reach out and try and connect with other communities and help people and help to generate stories that can bring people along with us in the right direction, because there are a lot of very powerful stories that are pushing us in the wrong direction. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Sorry to those who wanted to ask a question in this section. Hopefully you'll be able to ask your question later on, and certainly as part of the second part of the programme. So I'd now like to hand over to Tim. And is Skeena in the room?
Thank you. So I'm going to hand directly over to Skeena, in fact.
Hello, yes, it is. Just wasn't okay. Hello, my name is Skeena. I'm really moved, actually. I'm from a Kashmiri heritage, and I don't know. I've been with XR since September 2018, and I don't know if I've ever been to a meeting where I felt so at home, and in such a natural vibe, you know, with people really showing up as who they are, and people really respecting and honouring that. So I think I'm actually in a bit of shock because this is where we're going. This is what we want to create, and I haven't felt it in this way until today. So thank you so much to all of you who've helped create this. This is quite extraordinary. So we're going to have a break in a minute. But before we do, I wanted to kind of lay the ground as to what we're hoping to do when we come back together. How many people here, all that science, all that information that we've been given and the discussion around that and what it means for us in our lifetimes and our families, how many people in this room felt that they already had some awareness of that can you just show some hands? So the majority of you felt like, yeah, I've been dealing with the reality of what that information looks like for me. Okay. And how many of you feel like the emotional cycle of that you're at peace with? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So that's the bit, and it's not about a journey of coming into peace with it, but for me, it has been a journey, as I'm sure it has been for most of you here, of what do you do with that? What do you do when you emotionally connect? And actually, where's the space for that? And then where can that take you? And where in your lives are you really supported to go deeper within that? And then what effect does that have on your relationships and what you do with your time? And I've got something here. It's so I have 3 girls, And when my third daughter was born, it was a heat wave, 2010. And she didn't wear anything for 3 weeks apart from this occasionally. And the reason I've got this is because when I heard this information, and it was with Jem Bendell, Professor Jem Bendell, at a conference about leadership, I saw my children's lives disappearing. And I felt it as that. And when I woke up the next morning, it was a similar feeling to waking up every time I'd had one of my children. It was like waking up to a whole new world where I knew everything was different. And I knew that life would never be the same if I actually felt this information, if I actually allowed my whole self to feel it, and if I actually declared my own personal climate emergency, then I knew my life would never be the same again. And I think that a lot of us have been in that process together, and actually the world we live in, because it's business as usual, and it's Tesco as usual, and voting as usual, and whatever as usual, the distraction that Tim, that you mentioned, is still there. It's still huge in our lives. And I think the more we can go there into feeling and share it, then the more we can do. And that's what we're going to do after our break. So thank you. For our vision, for the vision that you are dreaming of and that you want to attend to and that you want for your families, there has to be a no. For a yes to be, there has to be a no. And rebellion is our no, right? Rebellion is where we withdraw our consent from this depraved, broken system, and we say no more. And no births a yes, just as yes contributes to a no. And both are born of love. Love asks for a no as well as a yes. If we think about the mothering instinct, which is available to all of us, man, woman, parent, not parent, if you think about Mother Earth, she has a no and a yes. And mothering instinct is all about protection as well as nurturing. It's all about your no as much as it is your yes. And so what I'm inviting us to do is to be in the balance of both of those. To find your conviction and your courage for your no, to step right to the edge. It is harder, she was right. I don't know this mother's name, but she was right. It's much harder to be in that place where you have to step forward, whole body, whole soul, and say, no, no more. I am withdrawing my consent. I am in rebellion. But it does birth the yes. And it births the yes for all of us, and in all kinds of magical ways. We wouldn't be able to do this. We wouldn't be at Davos, as some of us are. We wouldn't have been at COP. We wouldn't be getting radio show slots and TV slots if we hadn't said our no. And XR would not be the #1 global influencer in terms of climate change in the world right now if we hadn't said our no. And that is because of the great courage of people in this room and outside this room, and the people that had the courage to say no. So I want to leave you with that actually let's step forward in our no and our yes, Let's dream big and dream wild and intend for a beautiful world where we can find each other, where we can come together in our power and our love as we notice where our no lies all the time, and we honor that with great courage. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming this evening. I'm so grateful. And Esther, would you like to say something?
Thank you. Thank you, Skeena, for that close to our second session. We're now getting ready to close the event out. Can I ask Cecilia Cruz and the Chipchas to begin making their way to the front, because they are going to close us out. You staying? Okay, right. So Sister Jendai, if you just give us a 2-minute closeout, please, because time is very limited. And then, so if those who opened us out can make your way to the front whilst you're preparing, we will just say a few words by way of closure.
As a representative of the elders today, I would like to leave everyone with this message, in that our ancestors are connected to each other, and we do not separate our ancestors from our science. We do not separate our science from our spirituality. And we are one with nature. And we are one with nature from the beginning of iration, i.e. creation. And we take our lead from our ancestors of the ancient Nile Valley. Some of you will know of the latest civilization of the Nile Valley. You may know it as Egypt, the last of the Nile Valley civilizations, the last of the Nile Valley civilizations. We know it as Kemet. And in our spiritual structures, as our senior brother Kojo reminds us, we have the cardinal virtues of Ma'at: truth, justice, righteousness, balance, reciprocity, and order. And that is the foundation for our relationship with Mother Earth and humanity. And within the laws of Ma'at and the 42 declarations of Ma'at, we are reminded and we take responsibility. The 42nd declaration says, I have not stolen anyone's land. The 22nd says, I have not closed my ears to truth. Another one says, I have not polluted myself. Number 35 says, I have not polluted the water. So when we talk about ecocide, it is something that we recognize as a lifelong ancestral spiritual struggle that our ancestors have engaged with long before any of the texts of the so-called major world religions were a twinkle in anyone's eye. So we give credit and praise to our ancestors, because we know this is a battle for humanity, and we are confident in the power of our ancestors that we will be victorious. Ashe.
Thank you. So we have now come almost to the end of our program. Just to let you know that today is only the beginning. As I said, this event today is actually in two parts. The next part will be taking place, the 4 Degrees plus World Ecocide Alarm Program will be taking place as part of the Global Justice Rebellion Roadshow from Monday the 20th of April to Friday the 24th of April, which is Mother Earth Week, and we'll be having a number of activities right here in the Caribou. This will continue into May. August, the 1st of August, African Emancipation Day Reparations March, and Carnival at the end of August, and so forth. I just wanted to close with a quote from one of those who's held up as somebody in the African liberation struggle that many of us hold very dearly, the Honourable Marcus Mosiah Garvey. And he told us over 70 years ago, he was talking about extinction, and in particular, what would happen to African peoples and other original peoples on planet Earth if we did not find a way to restore sovereignty as a result of centuries of colonization and dispossession. He said the battles of the future, whether they be physical or mental, will be fought on scientific lines. And he went on to say, and the race that is able to produce the highest scientific development is the race that will ultimately rule. So, brothers and sisters, I wanted to, and those who have the ears to hear what that message is saying, it also, I think, tells us about the importance of us utilizing science, spirituality, in our struggle to restore ourselves, to renew ourselves, and to repair and stop the harm and ensure that we put in place something that is much more humane, okay? And by way of thanks, I'd like to thank each and every one of you that has come out this evening. I'd also like to thank in particular those members who are still here who come from Global South communities, because we know some of the challenges that there have been in trying to engage in platforms like this. So I particularly commend you for coming out, despite many of the obstacles, and even perhaps wondering what have we got in common. We'd like to thank everybody who participated in the program this evening, those of you who contributed to the opening ceremony and now the closing ceremony, of course, our wonderful panelists, our esteemed elders. But we particularly would like to thank those who played a key role in organising, and I have to give a special mention to Cindy, Naomi, Tim, Lynn, Tom, Peter, and the rest of the tech crew. Thank you very much. And we're now going to, as appropriately as we began, we're going to close out with some soul food from Cecilia Cruz and the Chip Chaz. Thank you. Thank you.